The book is called Deceiving the Sky, Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy. Bill Gertz, how are you, sir?
Hi, good to be on the program.
Well, tell us what the core point is of your book.
Well, Mark, I've been fighting this battle for over 20 years, basically trying to alert people to what I call the China threat or the threat from China. This book is kind of the culmination of 20 years of in-depth reporting and inside information that I've gathered that really looks at the nature of the Chinese threat, which has radically changed since I first started covering this back in the 80s. And it really took a turn for the worse under the regime of Xi Jinping, the current Chinese leader, who has announced what he calls the China Dream, which is really a communist nightmare. And he's actually has his sights set on global hegemony, that he wants China to be the dominant superpower in the world. And in order to do that, he has to diminish the United States.
And tell us about this guy. He worked his way up through the bureaucracy, through the Communist Party, fairly quietly, right?
Yeah, he was the vice president of China, and then his family was purged. He was sent to the countryside, but rather than turn against communism, he became even more radically communist. And he did his doctoral thesis on scientific socialism, the euphemism for communism. So you can imagine this is a guy who is steeped in communist ideology.
And he's purged pretty much anybody who opposes him, hasn't he?
Absolutely. He's taken complete power. I report in Deceiving the Sky how he has actually moved into Mao's residence inside the leadership compound in Beijing known as Zhongnanhai. Up until that time, it had been a museum and nobody was living in it. Mao was kind of this glorified founder of the communist regime who made some mistakes. They have an actual formula in China for how to look at Mao. But Xi Jinping has become the new Mao, the new emperor.
Does he really have any serious opposition, or is any opposition developing, given, frankly, how Donald Trump is really punishing his regime and given what's going on in Hong Kong? In other words, there's a lot of unrest out there.
Absolutely. Donald Trump has really initiated a revolutionary shift in policy towards China. For the last 40 years, we've been involved in a gamble that says if we just trade with China, if we're just nice with China, that this is going to turn it into a benign, non-communist power, and it's been an utter failure. And Donald Trump was the first one to recognize that, so he's the one that's taking tough action across the board, primarily in the economic sphere, but it's impacting all the other spheres. Law enforcement, intelligence, we have a crackdown on Chinese spying, we have these tariffs that are in place. The Chinese economy is in deep trouble, and that spells real trouble for the communist regime. As for internal opposition, Xi Jinping since 2013 has initiated a massive purge, and in that system, it's kind of a mafia-like system over there where they have these crime families that are actually Communist Party families that run things. And a number of these families are on the outs now, and that has a ripple effect, not just in the political system, but in the military. The People's Liberation Army, which again is not a national army, it's a party that's beholden to the Communist Party of China. And there's a lot of unrest in there. From my research, they've purged some of the top people. And again, this instability is seen in, there have been massive protests of veterans, PLA veterans who have been kicked out of the military. They've actually had demonstrations, and they had to set up camps to put thousands of these PLA veterans who are protesting that the government's not taking care of them, but that reflects a deeper political unrest that's behind it.
Do you think the day might come where he's overthrown, potentially?
Right now, the regime is pretty stable, but I think there's an undercurrent, and again, because we have really very little visibility into the inner workings of this place I mentioned, Zhongnanhai, which is the leadership compound. We had a massive intelligence failure back in 2010 where as many as 30 of the CIA's recruited assets were rolled up by the Chinese. And they're not even sure exactly what the cause was. It was either a traitor or several traitors in the CIA, and we've had 3 convictions of former CIA and intelligence people just in the last 2 years, or it was a breakdown in agent communications that allowed the Chinese to figure out who the recruited agents were. So we don't have good intelligence. Very much like the Soviet Union, nobody predicted the Soviet Union was going to collapse, and the same thing could happen in China because, again, with a little bit of pressure, the whole thing could come crumbling down in Beijing.
And that's so true, isn't it? Because even their financial system is really not that stable. I mean, they're constantly having to manipulate their currency to try and affect their trade and their economies one way or another. People are used to living a certain way there. They have really overbuilt, I mean, physically, buildings. Mm-hmm. But let me turn to their military. What are they doing militarily that's a great threat to the United States?
Well, they have achieved kind of a asymmetric, what they call assassin's mace capabilities. In other words, this goes back to ancient Chinese strategy, which is where the title of the book comes from, Deceiving the Sky. It goes back to the Warring States era, where how does a weaker power defeat a stronger one? China has studied that, and they've developed certain niche capabilities in their armaments. For example, they've developed very formidable cyber weapons capabilities. We've detected them inside of our critical infrastructure, which, again, the most critical is our electric grids. They've have evidence that the Chinese hackers have done what they call cyber reconnaissance. They've mapped our electric grid, and for a future conflict or crisis, they could literally turn out the lights on us. On another area is satellite weapons, anti-satellite weapons. They've developed an array of weapons to attack satellites. And if you think about it, with knocking out about 24 of our most critical satellites, they could cripple our society, our economy. They have missiles that can shoot down satellites, several of them at high Earth orbit.
And what do we have? As I understood it, the Obama administration cut funding for our satellite weaponry.
We have, it's very interesting, we recently established a space command, a space force, but they have no space weapons. And that's because the doves in Congress, the Democrats, have refused to fund space weapons. Now, we do have capabilities that can be converted to space weapons, and we demonstrated that in 2008. There was a falling satellite, and we took one of our anti-missile interceptors, and we modified it so that it was able to shoot down a satellite that was falling into the ocean rather than impact on land. So we have the capabilities, but as far as we know, the Pentagon has not tipped its hand on what it's doing or what it plans to do in terms of space weaponry to counter China. But they're very aware that the Chinese are moving ahead. They have lasers that can fry satellite electronics. They have small robotic satellites that can maneuver, and they have robotic arms that can crush or smash satellites on orbit. So things are, those two areas, I think, are the most critical areas where the Chinese are either on par with us or perhaps ahead of us in terms of advanced weaponry.
And their goal basically is to blind us because we rely so heavily on, I'll use pedestrian GPS type systems, for our missiles, for our jets, even for our tanks. And I think the thinking is they saw how we fought the Iraq War, they saw how we fought in Afghanistan, and they determined, as did the Russians, okay, we can't really necessarily outman these guys, so we have to take out their technology.
Yes, and they are working advanced technology in a couple of areas that are a big concern, and that's artificial intelligence and quantum communications and quantum computing. One of our strategic advantages is our intelligence capability, and the best of our intelligence capability is NSA, its ability to break into communications and get them.
Don't get mad, I only have 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, and so they're working very hard on that. The U.S. is also working very hard on that, but the Chinese pose a major threat. And in Deceiving the Sky, I've done as much as I can to alert the American people to this threat. This is an extremely important book, and it's easy to read and very clear in its message.